All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Maria Noel Groves' workshop, Empower Your Immune System with Herbs and Mushrooms. We're looking forward to diving into this exciting topic. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly go over the workshop format. I'm Chadley Kolb with NOFA New Hampshire. I'll be moderating this session with fellow NOFA staff members Nikki and Laura. Hi, guys. We're asking everyone to please keep yourselves muted during the workshop and type your questions into the chat box throughout the discussion. We'll read out your questions when we get to the Q&A portion of the session. Please note we are recording this meeting and all workshop sessions, which will become available to you after the conference. And one last note, I wanted you guys to know that we are having a raffle at today's annual meeting at 12:30. So you must be present to win the prizes. Okay, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Maria Noel Groves, and she will take it over. Okay.
And let me also change my view a little bit here. So I am once I get going, just so I have fewer things to pay attention to, I will not be able to see you guys. So you'll have to interrupt me if anything happens. But I welcome. Thank you guys so much for having me here today. I'm very excited, and I think you guys can all hear me. I hope so. You'll tell me if I can't or if you can't. And today we're going to talk about herbal immune empowerment. So mainly focusing on things like the common cold and flu, but we will get into kind of our current situation as well as best we can. And I want to draw your attention to a couple things. One, I always throw a lot more into my talks than I can really possibly cover in the time allotted. But I wanted to still give you some good information. So there are stars on some slides, and that's partly for me to remember that those are mostly bonus slides. So you'll be able to go back and access those slides. So they are currently available to download right now and will remain at least for the next 6 months to a year or so on my website. If you go to wintergreenbotanicals.com/immune, and you can download the slides. Also, there are some times where I have, additional resources, blogs, link to studies, that kind of thing underlined. And you can click those when you have the PDF open. You can click on those and they will open up those links, or a link to a book, or a link to a podcast or blog post or something like that. So you won't be able to do it obviously right now because we're in a video mode, but once you download the slides, you can take advantage of them. So just a little bit about me. My name is Maria Noel Groves. I've been working with medicinal herbs for more than 20 years. My practice is Wintergreen Botanicals out in Allenstown, New Hampshire. And my practice is all about education. So I don't sell products. So I'm not, if anybody comes to me later saying, can I buy this from you? Except for my books. There's nothing else that I sell to the public, but I do focus on education and empowerment. So I teach classes, and that's really what I'm mostly involved with right now in the pandemic. There's been a big demand for herbal education, so that takes up most of my time. I also see clients. I don't work with COVID clients because I don't do urgent kind of care needs. My schedule is just not set up that way. And I'm not actually taking new clients right now in general anyway, because I'm just too busy. And then I have a background in writing. So I have my 2 books that I'll show you in a moment. And I also write for a lot of different magazines and publications. So those are my 2 books. They are available in the bookstore through the conference. Main Street Bookstore is kind enough to be selling them, and you'll get 20% off of the purchase will go back to NOFA. I think you might have to write NOFA New Hampshire in the comments when you're purchasing it. I do also sell the books directly, but certainly for the conference, I would recommend that you go ahead and order through NOFA New Hampshire. And then if you like to be in person for things, the Concord Food Co-op does sell signed copies of my book through their store as well. And most bookstores do have it. I have tons of information on my website for free. And so that's what this slide is all about. I also do a regular mailing list with seasonal musings and such. And I have a lot of safety suggestions and rules. I don't want to dwell on them too much in the interest of time, but I do think that they're important so that you approach herbs in an educated and empowered and safe way. The herbs that we'll be discussing today are generally really safe and well tolerated by most people, and most of them are even relatively kid friendly. But this isn't medical advice. I am not a doctor. I can't diagnose and prescribe, but even more so in this kind of a setting, it's really just for purely educational purposes, because you may have, no one herb is right for everybody. And you may have a reason why any one of the things that I discussed today might not be appropriate for you. So you can consult with a holistic healthcare professional like an herbalist or a naturopathic doctor. It's always a good idea to be talking with your doctor and keep your doctor in the loop. And if you are planning on doing a lot of self-care, which is what this class and my classes and my books are all about, then I certainly would recommend these 4 basic safety rules just so that you approach it in a safe and well-educated way. So one would be to research your herbs in at least 3 different resources to get a good idea of what the herbs do and what their cautions are, and whatever their medicinal uses are, even beyond what you're using it for. For example, cinnamon's pretty safe, awesome herb in a lot of ways, but it does lower blood sugar, and it's also really good for helping stop up diarrhea. But that makes it not appropriate for some people. It might be inappropriate if you're on blood sugar medications, or if you tend towards hypoglycemia in between a meal on an empty stomach. And if you tend towards constipation already, you might find that having lots of cinnamon makes you constipated. So it's just good to get to know your plants, at least through that research side of things. And I have lots of resources on my website, especially on the links page. And I have a recommended reading page where you can find good websites and good books, besides my own, of course, but other sources as well, because I'm only one of at least 3 sources. And number 2, listen to your body and your intuition. Get a feel for how things feel in your body. Start with a low dose if it's your first time ever taking an herb, and then slowly build up. In an acute situation, oftentimes the recommended doses can be pretty high, like, teaspoons or more of some of these herbs. But if it's your very first time, just, for the first moment or so, have a little bit, see how it's agreeing with your body or not, and then gradually increase the dose. And if it's something that you're using for daily use, long haul, then you may take, several days to a week to gradually build up the dose. But in an acute care situation, usually you don't have that luxury of time. If you are harvesting any plants on your own, make sure that you've identified it 100%. Mistakes happen all the time. Plants are often mislabeled. Even sometimes seeds don't come up as what you expect them to. So just never take anything for granted. Key it out, look up descriptions online and pictures, get some field identification guides, make sure that you have what you think you have. And then last but not least, double check for herb drug interactions. Most of the things that we're going to be talking about today have a relatively low risk for herb drug interactions, but nothing is ever absolute. And certainly Echinacea may clear some medications out a little bit more quickly, may affect some immune medications. Ginger may affect blood thinning. So there are some concerns to be aware of. So at the very least, double check with your pharmacist or herbalist, and then proceed from there. And let's see, I have a clicker so I don't have to keep reaching over. So also just some quick pandemic disclaimers. So I am mainly focusing on strategies for the cold and flu that are pretty common in herbal medicine. A lot of these things probably do have some benefit in COVID, but COVID is a much more complicated illness. There's a lot we don't know. We know nothing for sure about anything, including herbs, when it comes to COVID. And it can also be much more severe in some cases, much more unique. So there are different aspects to COVID. It's not just a respiratory illness, for example, and it can also escalate and become really deadly very quickly. And so just please be aware of those things as we're talking about things. Also, I want to say that even though I have been following the pandemic and herbs and just in general pretty closely, I am not an expert in that. And I don't work with COVID in my practice because I just don't have the schedule that allows for the urgent care required in that kind of situation. So I don't have any personal experience with this, with COVID. I do with colds and the flu. And there is no hard science currently for COVID. There are a lot of suggestions, and I'll have a slide on that later on with lots and lots of links that you can check out. But even for cold and flu, the hard scientific evidence can be pretty mixed and preliminary and or limited. So there's research on a lot of the things that we'll be talking about, but to varying degrees of quality. There are no human clinical trials that have been done with herbs that I'm aware of, at least, and COVID, although there are some that are underway currently. So why do we get sick? Why do we catch infections like the cold and flu at all? There are a couple different things at play. And if you ever have heard of the whole, the germ versus the host debate, it certainly plays in here. So, is it because of the germ that we get sick? Certainly if there was no germ, we wouldn't get sick. But is it also the host? Because how healthy you and your terrain are will determine whether or not you actually get sick from that microbe, as well as how sick you get from it. And there's certainly truth to that with all illnesses. There are some that are particularly virulent that might get you no matter how great you are, but there's a play of both of these. And there are some things that we can do to help support our general health and reduce our likelihood of getting infection. And a lot of this stuff is the stuff that, especially in a pandemic year, you've been hearing about already. Certainly reducing your exposure to germs, like washing your hands with just plain old soap and water, staying home when you're sick, being careful when you're around sick people, masking up, all that good stuff. All the usual stuff applies here. But also, I want to call your attention to things like stress and sleep. And that's something that's really important to prioritize. There have been several studies that have shown that just sleeping less than like 6 or 7 hours a night for one night will about triple the risk of catching the rhinovirus, which is the common cold. And in this study, they swabbed everybody with the rhinovirus. So everybody was exposed in their nasal passages. But the people who hadn't gotten, or had gotten 6 or fewer hours of sleep the night before, that they were 3 times more likely to actually get sick with the cold versus people who had gotten 7 or more hours of sleep per night. So aim for a good amount of sleep. Also, some people just have a weak immune system and they're more apt to catch things. I know that for myself personally, I get thrown out of whack really easily, especially if I don't get a good night's sleep or if I'm around, I work from home even normally. So if I'm around a lot of kids and kid germs at normal times, we go to parties or something like that. When it's not a pandemic, we often end up sick. So paying real close attention to supporting the immune system. And we'll talk about some herbal approaches for that as well. Also, I didn't mention, but stress can play a big role in your immune system. So as best as we can, we don't want to stress out about not getting sleep or being stressed in a pandemic, but we want to just take as good care of those things as we can, because that's one way that we can support our immune system. Low vitamin D levels do seem to be pretty implicated in a lot of different infections and our susceptibility to catching the cold, the flu, and even possibly COVID. They show a link, especially with low vitamin D levels and increased susceptibility to catching these illnesses and the severity of these illnesses. Whether or not taking it as a dietary supplement will prevent that, we don't necessarily know quite as well, but it's easy enough to support your vitamin D levels with supplements or in the summertime being out in the sun. Here's a quick recipe for sanitizer. I just use alcohol and bring it to about 60 to 70% with water, and then have other recipes as well, but you can check that out on the slide. And, no matter what's going on with your immune system, whether you're being exposed, you have a weak immune system, you didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, there, in all these situations, there is a place for herbs to help bolster the immune system. Not just herbs, we'll also be talking about mushrooms and some other remedies as well. Nothing is a guarantee, so you might still get sick, but these things should help. They make you maybe less likely to get sick and less likely to have severe illness, but don't ever take anything for granted. Like some people will think, oh, well, because I took my Echinacea or elderberry syrup, I don't need to wear a mask or wash my hands. I'll just be fine. And these herbs are not like miracles, but they do really help out quite a bit. So they should lend some support. So basic things that you can do for support. We already talked about sleep. You'll see in this little link here, once you have the slides, you can actually pull up one of the studies. There's more than one that's out there, but that one will bring up one of the better studies that you can look at regarding that if you want to. Certain things in our diet and nutrition are good for our immune systems, including when we talk about COVID, things that we seem to see in the research that is linked to it. So having lots of plant foods in the diet, having adequate amounts of vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin zinc, or sorry, the mineral zinc, selenium, omega-3 fatty acids, green tea, spices, mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, especially. These are all things that may help support the body, and that there's some level of evidence for the cold, the flu, and or COVID that having them in your system makes you a little bit more resistant. Of course, avoiding alcohol or limiting it, avoiding smoking, and other sorts of activities that increase inflammation in your body, especially when it comes to COVID, because it is also profoundly an inflammatory disease. And all the other good things that we know about already. We're going to talk about astragalus and medicinal mushrooms and how phenomenal they can be as daily tonics. And then there are just kind of good things that are immune tonics that we can incorporate as we desire into our diet, like bee balm, oregano, garlic, thyme, fermented foods, ginger, green tea, spices. And then if you think that you might be exposed or you're more susceptible, then using something like echinacea or elderberry can be very useful. And we'll get into a lot of these in more detail in just a moment. So if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. And at the end, we'll take about 10, maybe 15 minutes or so, and I'll be happy to try to get to as many questions as I can. So mushrooms are my first and one of my favorite categories for immune support. And these are a great answer for folks who are like, I just want to support my body as best as I can when I'm going into cold and flu season. Or maybe you're somebody who gets pneumonia every year anyway. You know, a lot of times I'll turn to medicinal mushrooms as a regular daily tonic that will help support the immune system. And there are lots of studies to support the idea that mushrooms can help out the immune system. And they're pretty cool. So mushrooms have these really neat complex starches called polysaccharides. These include glucans and beta glucans, but there are a lot of different kinds. Those are just a few examples of them and a few categories of them. And what these glucans and polysaccharides seem to do is they go into the body and they challenge the immune system a little bit. And one of the theories is that, you know, fungal infections are not really like they can be a thing. And the idea is that the body has evolved trying to fend off these, you know, fungal invaders. And so that when you consume one that's benign, which are medicinal mushrooms and our edible mushrooms are generally very benign and health promoting, but your immune system mounts a little bit of a challenge. And so what I think of is it's like sending your immune system to boot camp so that it can just fine tune communication. You get healthier levels of immune cells, and the immune system just in general functions better in almost every way possible. And so it might seem like it could be a bad thing to ramp up the immune system. And that's not exactly what the mushrooms are doing. What they seem to be doing is modulating and just improving communication and function. So just, you know, doing that boot camp thing so that everything works better when it's under pressure and things are nice and calm when it's not under pressure. So research does support the use of medicinal mushrooms to help in things like autoimmune disease and allergies to help downregulate those, but we also will use them in conditions like regular infections, pneumonia, asthma, cancer. Even mushrooms seem to be helpful because they improve your body's ability to deal with all of these things so that it functions better. And these are best to consume pretty regularly, especially throughout, like if you know that normally you're going to get sick in cold and flu season, or, you know, the kids are going back to school, just even in normal times, the kids are going back to school, maybe a month or so before that, you might want to start taking them yourself just to support, and then throughout the season. So these are something you can do regularly. One of the cool things about one of the other cool things about mushrooms, there are many cool things about mushrooms, but one of them is that they make vitamin D in their skin much in the same way that animals do. So if you take a mushroom like a shiitake or a maitake mushroom and you put it out in the sun or under UV light, especially if you turn it upside down, like, you burn the most in the places that don't normally see the sun. Well, mushrooms are the same way. So if you turn them upside down in the sun or under UV light, they will make vitamin D and become profoundly high in vitamin D. And then you can use those sun or UV treated mushrooms as a vitamin D supplement as well. It is vitamin D2, not vitamin D3, but it does seem to have a benefit in the body according to the research that has been done. And in one sample study, this is one that Paul Stamets, who runs a mushroom company, just as a disclaimer, but he took 3 ounces of shiitake, put them in the sun for 6 hours, and it went from having 110 IU of vitamin D to 46,000 IU of vitamin D, and that 3 ounces of shiitake mushroom. And they do retain that, so you could then dehydrate the mushroom in the dehydrator totally, and then be able to have just like a small piece of one mushroom on a daily basis to get your vitamin D. And then you might have more of your mushrooms that are not treated that you would have for just general immune support. When we're working with mushrooms, they are a little more finicky than herbs are as far as how to best extract them for a couple different reasons. Some even safe mushrooms might have a moderate amount of toxicity or indigestibility if you have them raw. And so for those otherwise safe and edible mushrooms, if you cook them, that makes them safe to eat. Now, I just want to be clear that if you have a toxic mushroom, like an overt, deadly Amanita mushroom, if you cook it, it's still toxic. Just, one mushroom could kill you of the bad one. So I'm not saying that cooking will negate all toxins in mushrooms, but in our otherwise safe medicinal and edible mushrooms, they are better for you once they're cooked. Also, mushrooms, when you have the fruiting body, which is what we technically call the mushroom, it's the reproductive part of the mushroom, or the part that produce the reproductive spores, that is also going to be better cooked because they have this chitin fiber in them that is similar to the fiber that's in your shellfish shells. So if you think about how tough like a lobster shell is, there's a similar constituent in your mushroom, and that's bound up with the beneficial polysaccharides. So what we want to do is simmer them or cook them so that we can help break down that chitin so that we can even access the benefits. So if you're just eating lots of raw mushrooms or raw mushroom powder, you're probably not going to get the benefits. Even if it doesn't make you sick, it's probably not going to be bioavailable to your body to utilize it. So you want to cook them. Hot water extractions are really popular, so simmering them in broths. If you have the dried and you powder them before you throw them in, that's even better to improve the extraction. And then you can even consume like the sludge of the powder as well. But if you have fresh mushrooms, you can cook them up and eat them however you like. That's great too. And so there are a bunch of different ways you can use them. You can use them in food. You can saute them. You can put them in soups. You can put them in broths. You can make teas with them, some of the ones that are palatable enough to make teas with. And then there are also some ways to take them as dietary supplements. There are a lot of different kinds of mushroom dietary supplement products on the market. So just make sure that you're not getting something that's just a plain old powder that you're just then consuming without cooking it. You could have a plain powder, but you'd want to, saute it up in a pan with some food or simmer it or do something special to it. Some of the powders that are out there are mycelium powder. So they actually grow the mushroom on usually a grain. And then once the mushroom is pretty much infiltrated, or technically the mycelium has infiltrated it, they'll then dehydrate and powder it. So you end up with usually a grain and this mycelium, which is the white stuff that you'll see when you pick up a rotting log. And that does offer some benefits as well. There's debate in the herbal and mushroom community over how beneficial mycelium is versus a fruiting body, which is more traditionally used, but they do both have benefit. And a lot of the United States organic mushroom products and capsules are mycelium products. And I do get results in my own health and in my own practice with those two, even though that's not probably quite as strong and doesn't have as much of a traditional use, especially in places like China, where they've been using fruiting body mushrooms for centuries, if not millennia, for healing and for health. And you can also get liquid extracts. Those usually aren't as potent, but they can still have some benefits as well. And I do have blog posts out there that you can check out for how to make your own mushroom tincture. But it's really not the most effective way to use it. So not everybody tolerates mushrooms. So if you're somebody that just doesn't, you're allergic to mushrooms or you just really hate them, then astragalus root has some similar properties. And on my website, I do have a broth recipe and a chai tea mushroom deep immune recipe as well. And my favorite mushrooms, especially when it comes to immune health, it would be shiitake. I get the dried shiitakes and I just powder them up with my grinder and throw them into soups and stocks and recipes, and they're just really delicious and kind of mild. I don't really love mushroomy flavors, but that one's a really nice one just for general immune support. There's quite a bit of research on it, and there's even a little bit of research to suggest that it might be beneficial in COVID, but nothing that is actually proven. It's all just kind of applying what data we already had and applying the concepts to COVID, but it might be helpful and it probably isn't going to hurt. Maitake is a nice one, especially if you can get a hold of it fresh. There are a lot of New Hampshire mushroom growers out here around, like David Witchland, and I think it's New Hampshire Mushroom Company. So if you can get a hold of a fresh, beautiful maitake mushroom, they are delicious. Reishi mushroom is one of my favorites for health purposes, and I've got another slide, we'll get into it, but it is a little bit more bitter. So reishi is pretty hard. This is we've got a couple different kinds of reishi, but this is one of them right here. And it's hard. It's like if you put it, you could knock it on something and it's like solid wood. So it's a little bit bitter. It's a little bit solid. You're not going to be eating it, but you can still make extracts with it. You can make teas with it. You can take it as a dietary supplement. Turkey tails are pretty common and something that you could potentially wildcraft once you've learned how to identify them properly. And they're somewhat available in commerce as well. And there's a lot of just general evidence around cancer and general immune support for turkey tails. Lion's mane is another pretty cool mushroom that if you can get it fresh, it's so delicious. And some of our local mushroom growers do grow that and sell it. But it does seem to have an extra benefit of being a great brain tonic and a little bit of a mood lifter as well. And so that might be particularly useful if folks have some amount of nerve damage or weird nerve stuff going on. I am not going to be focusing on chaga, which is down here. It looks kind of like ground up coffee or instant coffee. So chaga is a cool fungal growth. It's not technically a mushroom, but there are some sustainability reasons. So for that reason, I am trying to downplay the use of chaga in favor of things that are much more widely available, much more sustainable to wildcraft and or to cultivate. And any edible safe mushroom will do. So you can just go to the grocery store and get, portobellos or crimini mushrooms, button mushrooms, and then cook them. And those are great. And those are pretty readily available. And shiitake mushrooms are pretty readily available in the grocery stores too. So just a little highlight on reishi, which includes Ganoderma Lucidum and a couple other Ganoderma species that are more or less interchangeable. And as I mentioned, this is a pretty hard wood conch, and it's also a little bit on the bitter side. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. You're not going to be eating this one for dinner, but you can use it in a lot of other formats. And it's a phenomenal mushroom, like an all that in a bag of chips kind of mushroom. So reishi is really nice for supporting the immune system, but it's also anti-inflammatory. It is particularly helpful where there may be allergies and inflammation. It does seem to help downregulate inflammation. It may help support sleep, but at the same time, it's almost like a deep energizing adaptogen. Adaptogens are herbs that help our body adapt to stress through a couple different mechanisms, but basically the short answer is they help the body adapt to stress. And reishi mushroom does seem to do that, but on a very subtle but nice, deep building, calm energy kind of level, while also supporting sleep and a calm state if there's maybe anxiety. It's gentle, but really nice for that. And it's also a really profound lung tonic as mushrooms go. It seems to help with oxygen utilization, especially if you've been taking it regularly. So you can see how this would be a pretty neat mushroom, especially these days. And it's one that I do personally take daily as a capsule just because it's easy to take that way. But you can also make really concentrated syrups. Another fun way to work with mushrooms is you just kind of simmer them and simmer them and simmer them. You could simmer them for like a whole day in a crock pot or multiple days, then strain them out and then to continue simmering without the lid on so that you end up with this very concentrated, deep, dark, rich, almost syrupy tea. And then you can freeze that in ice cube trays. You could use that to make an alcohol extract, combine it with an alcohol extract to make it shelf stable, although that you will lose some benefits because alcohol and mushrooms really don't play that nice together. It might ruin some of those beneficial polysaccharides, but you'll get other benefits from it. And you can also just put it in a ice cube tray, and then that way you have an instant tea that you can just throw together this really quick ice cube in your hot mug, and you've got an instant tea or an instant broth. Shiitake, as I mentioned, is another favorite, mostly because it's just really delicious, and there is quite a bit of research to support it for general immune health and maybe helpful in COVID as well. And there is research on Ganoderma or reishi being potentially beneficial in COVID as well. Again, this is not any trial or anything. This is just theoretically looking at the research that's out there. And so when you get the slides, you can check out these bonus slides on various other mushrooms. Astragalus is another really great immune tonic that you can consider for general benefit. And this is one you can grow. It takes a couple years before you can harvest it, and you may not get a huge harvest. I find that my underground rodents, which are pretty plentiful in my garden, like to eat astragalus. So I never managed to get any to harvest. So you can go and buy this if you can find it. Availability during the pandemic can sometimes be a little tricky, but astragalus has somewhat similar properties to the medicinal mushrooms in terms of daily tonic, immune modulating, nice general tonic, and rich in polysaccharides. It's easier to extract because you don't have those tough mushroom chitin compounds to deal with. So it's a little bit more adaptable to various remedy techniques. And you can use them in a lot of the same kinds of recipes you would do mushrooms. And it's technically a legume, not a mushroom. So if somebody has issues with mushrooms, they could turn to astragalus instead. And traditionally in Chinese medicine, which is where we tend to use this herb, it's also called astragalus propinquus. That's the new species name. Membranaceus is the old species name. That's the same plant. And traditionally in Chinese medicine, they didn't use it in acute infection, and they would tend to lean on using it more for the daily tonic side of things. There are also lots of respiratory and immune adaptogenic herbs here we use them more for stress and energy, but they do seem to have some deep tonic immune benefits, and also may have some benefits for deep tonic effects for the respiratory system as well. So you could consider including them in your daily routine, maybe picking the one that suits you best. And I didn't put it on here. It's not technically an adaptogen, but lemon balm is also worth considering because it does have some antiviral effects, and it's a really great calming nervous system support herb. It's not an adaptogen, but it does kind of sort of work well with these herbs. So if you start to get sick, if you start to come down with something, here are some basic things that you can do. First and foremost, spend as much time as you possibly can resting and sleeping. That's one of the best things you can do. And usually we get sick when we're doing too much. It can also be, especially these days, just from exposure, but especially with the cold and the flu and colds in particular, a lot of times they get us when we're really doing too much and we're not resting enough. So making sure to just take that time to listen to your body, to just, lay on the couch and sleep and rest as much as possible. That'll also make sure that your body can utilize all the energy that it does have to help fight the illness. And resist the urge, because sometimes with infections, they kind of go back and forth a little bit. So, you might feel really cruddy for a day or two, and you have to put your life on hold for a little bit, and then you might feel a little better. And it might be tempting to do all those errands and clean the house and do, go back to work or whatever you need to do. But oftentimes that's where we end up getting worse. And that's true not only potentially in COVID, but also in the cold or flu. And this is how things can end up, like the common cold may turn into pneumonia, is from bouncing back too soon. And you've got an immune system that's already a little bit run down, a body that's lost a lot of vitality trying to fight an infection that's not totally gone yet. And then you put more demands on it and it becomes more susceptible. So just keep resting, even if you're starting to feel better. Keep resting, give yourself lots of TLC, broth, soup, tea, water, all that good stuff. You can incorporate, just hit it with as many of your immune tonics as you possibly can. So the mushrooms, not the astragalus, but mushrooms still, pungent herbs like garlic and onions, cayenne, bee balm, oregano, rosemary, any of those things would be great to consider. And also, this is when to really pull out herbs like echinacea or elderberry and be taking like a whole teaspoon of them every few hours, every hour, every 2 hours, every 3 hours, as often as you can think of it, and keep them in your system. There are other herbs that I don't turn to quite as much, but there is good research on them and traditions of use in their own native lands. So Andrographis from India and Umkalabawabu from, I believe that's how you say it, but Umka for short, from Africa. And there is some promise to those as well. But I'm trying to stick to the things that you might be able to grow or have readily available in the kitchen or the grocery store. Some common sense suggestions. If you do suspect that you might have COVID, call your doctor and consider getting tested, self-quarantine, all the other stuff. And then there are times where you should go immediately for medical care. So if you're having difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, if you're turning blue, if people are hard to wake or they seem confused, they're fainting, they're listless, they have really intense fatigue, they could be getting pneumonia or not getting enough oxygen. So they should probably seek immediate medical attention. Chest or upper abdominal pain could indicate a cardiac issue that should get checked out. Bleeding, sudden or severe pain, excessive amounts of vomiting or diarrhea are all reasons why you should not be self-treating, but going to the hospital, calling your doctor immediately. So echinacea, this is an herb that I think of as like mopping up the mess of the immune system or of an infection while also mobilizing the immune system. So this is not so much of a modulator. You could debate this because there are technically polysaccharides in echinacea root as well, but there's so much more dynamic pharmacy of constituents in echinacea that do a lot of different things when it comes to fighting a variety of infections. It has more of a history of use in dealing with bacterial infections and even possibly sepsis, which nowadays we have modern medicine and antibiotics and would be a cause for seeking those out. But it does have a long history of use for that. And so if you have like kind of like, I had a dental infection this past year that in the pandemic blew up quite a bit, and echinacea was a huge ally for me for just kind of keeping it at bay. It did not prevent me from needing to get a root canal, but it did do a really nice job keeping it at bay until I could finally get an appointment at an endodontist to have it taken care of. And if I hadn't, as the endodontist agreed, she's like, if you hadn't had that, this was such a bad infection. If you were not taking the echinacea, you probably would have been hospitalized. So it was just a pretty bad situation. But echinacea can be pretty amazing at helping the body through the lymphatic system, at clearing out the dead battle debris of fighting infection while also mobilizing white blood cells so that they're more active and ready to gobble up and fight up various types of pathogens, from viruses to bacteria and possibly fungal, but especially viral and bacterial infections are where we most focus on using echinacea. Echinacea is also great as a throat spray or as a tea, but especially throat sprays I love. And they're nice for when you're dealing with infections on contact in the throat because they inhibit some of the mechanisms that the bacteria and the viruses use. So there's an enzyme called hyaluronidase that the infections will use to break into your cells and break down your hyaluronic acid. And echinacea inhibits that enzyme and helps support that. And many, many other things. It's strongest as a fresh plant extract, especially using the root. The root's going to be the strongest, but you do get benefits in the whole plant, and it's a lot easier to harvest lots of the aerial or above ground parts of the plant. So often you'll find them used in combination. And fresh alcohol tinctures are really good for extracting echinacea's properties, but you could use it as teas and other recipes as well. It does make your tongue feel numb and tingly and weird and make you salivate. That is normal for echinacea, but there are some people who are allergic to daisy family flowers, and they may also react to echinacea. So be aware, use just a little bit first to make sure they agree with you. Not everybody with a daisy family flower allergy will have a reaction to echinacea, but some people do. And then on the same note, some people with autoimmune disease may also have a problem with echinacea because it may upregulate that autoimmune disease as well. It's somewhat rare, but it does occasionally happen. So again, just kind of pay attention, try a little bit first if you're thinking about working with echinacea and see whether or not it agrees with you, but know that that can happen and does happen with some people. I do like I'm not tied to them at all, but Gaia Herbs makes some pretty nice liquid extracts in a capsule. So that can be convenient. That's what I've mostly been using lately, just because I don't like the taste of the tincture. And I do have some directions here and then also on my blog with a short video where you can learn how to make fresh or dried plant tinctures. But for echinacea, I prefer to do a fresh plant if you have the availability. I also have a little slide here on some combinations and ways to make various types of throat sprays. There's lots of opportunity to play around. Usually you want some things that are antimicrobial and then some things that are soothing at the same time. So elderberry is another favorite of mine, and I often use it in combination with the flower because they both do have benefits in infections. And elderberry seems to work especially like a force field. So if you think of our different remedies here and how they're working on our immune army, you have the mushrooms and the astragalus that are sending it to boot camp so that everything functions better. The immune system just really knows how to do its job well. We have our echinacea that's like mobilizing. It's like, all right, let's go, folks, putting guns in their hands and sending them out, maybe doing a little bit of the cleanup of the debris of the battlefield as well. Elderberry is more like the force field. And so it's not really, in my mind, working so much on your immune system function itself. Like if you want to make your immune system stronger and healthier and more vital, that's where the mushrooms and the astragalus come in. But for that quick, like, oh no, I think I might be exposed or I'm starting to feel a little bit cruddy, elderberry can be great because what it does, it goes in and it binds to those it's probably does work for coronaviruses. There's a little bit of an evidence for that, but certainly the cold and the flu, it has been researched for, and it seems to bind to some of the receptors and prevent those viruses from being able to get into our cells. What viruses will do is they break into our cells and then they reprogram our cells to make more viruses. And then as those viruses kind of explode out of the cell, that's part of the damage that's caused, and that's how they replicate. So elderberry is really nice at the early onset of an infection to help limit how much of a chance that virus or other compound has to get into our cells and replicate and spread. So you could use elderberry later on, but it's probably not going to be as useful once you're already in a full blown, loaded with viral compounds kind of infection. It's best at those early stages. And you could use it on a daily basis too, but it's really just kind of like preventing your immune system from having to do its job. So I prefer to use it just more on an as needed basis. And the elderflower is a diaphoretic, so it makes you sweat. So it is nice in fevers to help with that. It's also a little bit of an antihistamine, so it can help with allergies, but it also is helpful for some of the histamine-like responses we have during an infection as well. So a lot of times I like combining them in a syrup. I also do take tea, like we're going to be doing all our socially distancing and stuff, but we're going to be skiing and stuff this weekend. And so I might be exposed to more immune infections than I'd like. So I've got my elderberry tea here along with other ingredients. And I have a bottle of syrup as well. If you've ever made wine and you've let an open bottle of wine sit around for a while, you know how it gets kind of brown and raisiny? Well, that can happen with elderberries too. Those polyphenols and pigments that are in the berries that are part of what's doing the good medicine of elderberry, they do have a somewhat short lifespan in that they start to precipitate out and bind to things and precipitate out of solution and are no longer quite as potent. So the more like purpley colored, the better for your elderberry. I have other things like hibiscus in this tea. So that doesn't always get quite that dark with elderberry alone, but it should be a really beautiful color. And your syrup should be a really nice color to be as strong as possible. And I find that syrups, because sugary substances help stabilize those pigments for a little bit longer, work quite nicely. And then also making sure that you're making a fresh batch every, 6 months or so. I store the extras in the freezer so that they stay extra fresh. And then I also keep a hold of dry berries so that I can make tea or make more syrup. So elderberries and to some extent elderflowers, but especially elderberries can be nauseating and even a little bit toxic when they're fresh. But if you cook them or dry them, then they're generally safe. Cooking them is the most established way to make them safe. However, you may lose a little bit of the medicinal activity with cooking. And so doing a, dry berry and then using hot water on it is the way that I personally really like to use it. And I have a whole blog on the research around elderberry. There are quite a lot of fun studies. I also go into, if you've heard the concerns about cytokine storm and if elderberry would be bad in something like COVID, I address that in that blog. So you can check that out. So here's a really nice elderberry syrup recipe from Darcy Blue that she's been generous enough to let me share. And that's one of the other ways alongside with tea that I use it the most often. And it's really quite tasty. And I love that it uses dry ingredients. So it's really to make, as long as you can get a hold of the dry ingredients, you can make it. And then there is an oxymel, which is a vinegar honey base. So if somebody wants something that's relatively shelf stable but alcohol free, this is one way to do that. And I have extra slides here. This is my tea that I'm drinking right now with elderberry and hibiscus and schizandra. And then I also have added lemon balm and butterfly blue pea flower to it as well. And it's tasty with a lot of honey. Ginger, and this may be where I more or less end things for today. I'll kind of skim through the rest just so you can see what's on the slides. But ginger is another absolute favorite of mine, especially in cold and flu season. And a lot of people did find it very useful when everything shut down and people were sick and nobody was getting, tested or treated, and they didn't have much to work with. So a lot of folks did find that things like ginger and rosemary were supportive. And ginger is my go-to tea whenever I'm coming down with a cold and a sore throat and all that kind of stuff. It has a lot of different actions, and I think of it as like burning the infections out. And that's not really exactly how it works, but it is a diaphoretic. So it's another herb that supports the fever response so that the fever can be more effective and faster at fending off whatever pathogen is present. It's also a little bit of a pain reliever. It also, when it's fresh, has a little bit of an antiviral effect. So I personally prefer ginger in the fresh root for this particular use when I'm using it for the immune system. And it also has some benefits for gut health. So if there is like a stomach bug, ginger is helpful for discouraging pathogens while encouraging your beneficial gut flora, and so many other things as well. It's good on a cold, when you feel cold, ginger is a great herb to consider. It is strong, so some people who have a sensitive stomach might not agree. If you're already like a hot constitution, ginger might not be great for you. And also ginger is a little bit blood thinning, so large amounts might be a problem. Also, when it comes to pregnancy, most of the things we've discussed are probably okay, but there's very little research on them. So you always have to take that with a little bit of salt and be just very cautious about that. But ginger in excessive amounts in large therapeutic doses is problematic in pregnancy. Usually you have to stick to just lower doses in pregnancy because it may act as an emmenagogue and bring on menstruation, which obviously you don't want. But really great. You can make it infused with honey. Honey kind of helps soften the harshness of the ginger. I do a lemon honey ginger tea, and that's one of my favorite ways to work with it. But you can add it to broth. You can do all sorts of things. And so this slide here has the recipe that I use to make my thermos tea. Onions, garlic, cayenne, horseradish, also fire cider, which is putting them all in a vinegar honey base, are all great ways to support the immune system and help fight off infections. We also have our aromatic herbs from the garden. So things like oregano, bee balm, rosemary, thyme, sage, anise hyssop, so many different things that they are antimicrobial and they're aromatic. They're great to do as a steam or a tea or a tincture, which is that alcohol extract. You can really make just about anything with them. They're good fresh or dry. And you can even use the essential oils. I don't personally like to use essential oils internally. That's a whole topic for another day, but they are nice if you put a little bit into hot water and use that as a steam. That's a quick, easy thing that you can do. Sometimes I'll even just put a few drops of essential oil in the shower with me on the floor so that I get a little bit of a steam with the aroma essential oils as I'm taking my shower. pine has somewhat similar properties to those aromatic antimicrobials, and something that's very widely available, especially white pine is a great one. And I have a winter herb walk that you can check out for that. How to do an herbal steam, which can be really great for respiratory congestion, very easy to make. And I have some teas like this Open Lungs Aromatic Tea #1. I love to brew it as a tea, inhale it as it's steeping, and use it as a steam in a sense. And then once it's cooled down to drink, then I'll strain it out and actually sip it as a drink. And that's got Korean licorice mint, which I'm on a little bit of a mission to get more people to grow. It's right here in that picture. But you can use aniseseed or fennel seeds similarly. Peppermint, thyme, bee balm, plantain leaf, marshmallow leaf, and some honey to taste if you want. And that's a great one for sore throats and lung crud and all that stuff. Another version of an aromatic lung tea, some cough syrup recipes in the slides, a little bit on marshmallow as a soothing. So when things are really dry, I love marshmallow root and or leaf for soothing dryness. Lots of tea recipes. I don't use licorice a lot, but it is potentially beneficial. And then I have lots of extra resources that you can check out. I've got an immune hub here. I've got recipes for some of my favorite teas. I've got some thoughts on COVID. There is a herbalist, Andrew Bentley, who has a really nice podcast and ebook, and he does do a lot of work with herbs and COVID in his community in Kentucky. And I've got a lung herbs. You can get a whole class audio recording and the notes through this lung herbs link. And so you can check those out if you download the slides at wintergreenbotanicals.com/immune. And just as an FYI, there are a lot of studies that have been sort of done. They're review studies. So they're looking at the literature that already exists on herbs and immune health and vitamins and minerals, or they're looking at like what are people's vitamin D status when they're going into the hospital with COVID. And they're kind of purporting that there may be a benefit for these things in the current pandemic. Nothing has been tested as proven to actually be benefit with a proper clinical trial yet, but these are just some things. And then you can check out these links. I bolded some of the ones that were the most interesting, but these are all full study text links that you can go to check out conversations on all these different herbs and supplements and general wellness things that we've already talked about for the immune system. So that's me. And we got 10 minutes. So we did it. I know we covered a lot and there's so much more we could have covered. There are so many herbs that can be useful for the immune system, but I wanted to focus on the ones that I personally love and use regularly for myself and for my clients. And also they're pretty readily, most of those things you could grow or find at the grocery store, or they're pretty commonly available. Pandemics can cause, some issues with getting sources, but I wanted to focus on just the basics. But you can utilize those resources I gave you if you want to delve into additional herbs and topics. So what do we have for questions?
Okay, thanks so much, Maria. I know we've got a bunch lined up. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Nikki, do you have some questions from the chat?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Maria. That was great. So I'm going to go in order here. Chaz asked, would drying mushrooms in a dehydrator result in similar vitamin D levels as sun drying the mushrooms?
That's a great question. No, it would not, because you need to actually be exposing it to sunlight or UV light. So if it's in the dehydrator, it's in the shade. So you can dehydrate your mushrooms and still use them for the immune benefits, but for vitamin D, they need to be under UV light or sunlight in order to make that vitamin D.
Great. The next question is from Danny, who asks, how would you rate oyster mushrooms for health benefits?
Oyster mushrooms don't have as much research for the immune supportive benefits, but they do have a little bit, and they fall into that category of when I said any edible mushroom still provides these polysaccharides and still will have benefits as an immune tonic. And you can also make vitamin D with them as well in that same way of putting them out in the sunlight. So oyster mushrooms are really easy to grow. They're pretty delicious. And so they would still be a great option, even though they don't have as many like extra benefits as say shiitake or especially reishi mushroom have. They're still just nice as a general mushroom to consume for that overall tonic effect on the immune system.
Awesome. And a similar question from Marie. What are the health benefits of chanterelles?
I have not done as much work with chanterelles. So, I mean, I think it would still be like your regular edible mushroom that would still have benefits as a polysaccharide rich food. But, usually people enjoy chanterelles just because they're like a delicious gourmet mushroom. And unless you're very lucky, you probably don't have like gobs of chanterelle that you're just going to use as medicine. So I would treat chanterelles as a lovely gourmet food that probably does support your immune system. But the other less expensive, more easily cultivated mushrooms might be good for like, using as medicine on a daily basis. But, make sure you really enjoy those chanterelles when you cook them.
Great.
Just 'cause they're special.
Another question here is from Nicholas, who asks, is there a Monarda species you would recommend? And if so, which parts would you use?
Yeah, I didn't have time to really get into that, but I love bee balm. It's one of the ones that I use quite a bit. And it has the medicine of oregano and thyme. Oop, there it is. Oregano and thyme together. So the one that I really like is this one here, which is the Monarda fistulosa. But Monarda didyma does have some benefits as well. And Monarda punctata, which is your horse mint, it's got like more the leaves are kind of like pinkish looking. The flowers themselves are not that exciting, and it's a little spotted. That one has similar activity to this fistulosa. But go ahead and taste, if you already have bee balm on your property, taste the leaves, taste the flowers when they're growing in season. And if they have this really nice, spicy, oregano-y, thymy flavor, then they're great to use as medicine. And even if they're more subtle, they probably still have benefit. But it's that carvacrol and thymol and those essential oil compounds that we often associate with oregano and thyme that we're really going after with the bee balm or the Monarda.
Okay, so wonderful. And Sweet Beet asked another question. Are there any different suggestions for someone with a long-term lung disease like pulmonary fibrosis?
Yeah, that is a good one. And I just want to back up to the bee balm question. If you're local to New Hampshire or to the area, I want to give a shout out to Anne at Foundwell Farm in Pembroke, because that's where I got the bee balm that I really like. And she is a organic NOFA member. So as far as long-term respiratory issues, so I don't have experience with it. Was it cystic fibrosis? What was it that, could you remind me what the condition was?
It was pulmonary fibrosis.
Okay, pulmonary fibrosis. I don't have experience specifically with that, but I think that you might find the lung class that I mentioned that's in the slides more specific to that. But things like mullein might be helpful there. Marshmallow might be helpful there. But I would, really listen to that lecture and see, kind of match things up to your specific situation. Some of the mushrooms may also be helpful, but, take it with a big grain of salt, because that's not a condition that I have a lot of experience. That said, I have worked with clients who have things like COPD, and we have, these are basically incurable conditions, but we have been able to support their respiratory function with things like mushrooms and mullein root, mullein leaf, and other respiratory tonics. So there may be some supportive benefits there, but check out the lecture there on lung herbs, as well as the notes on that link.
Great. So Jackie asked a question that you addressed about elderberry and cytokine storms. I heard you say you have a blog post on that. So I just want
Yes, it's right here. And the takeaway is it's very unlikely to be an issue. The concerns that have been raised about that are basically unfounded, but I go into all the science and explain that on the blog post. But regardless, the time to be using elderberry when it's most effective is in the early stages of an infection. And cytokine storm, if it's going to happen, it's rare, and it's usually like when you're in the hospital that is happening. It's not the time that you'd be self-treating anyway, but it's not likely to be a problem at all. It was a concern that was posed by somebody who was just theorizing, but there's no evidence to suggest that elderberry would actually cause a cytokine storm. And herbalists like Andrew that have have been using elderberry successfully and without any issues to help support people in the early stages.
Thank you. We have several more questions. I think we probably just have time for one or two more. Thank you everyone for all your great questions. So the next one is from Amy, who asks, for extracts and tinctures you're making yourself from mushrooms or herbs, how do you know what kind of dose of the active compounds you may be giving yourself, the concentration, and what is an appropriate quantity to take?
That's a good question. So the tincture link that I had on that particular slide will give you some basic information on tinctures. For these particular herbs that we're talking about today, relatively high doses in an infection are pretty common. So having, whole scoops full in tea, or, taking a whole teaspoon of extract or syrup is pretty common in these cases, where with other herbs, you may only take a milliliter versus 5 milliliters being a teaspoon. You might only take 1 milliliter, or about a quarter of a teaspoon of a tincture. So it really depends. And then if you're buying something that's already commercially made, I would follow the label directions there. But for just general, if you were making, say, a tincture, then through the methods that I suggest, then for most herbs, you'd be using like 1 to 3 milliliters of an herb. And for these particular ones for the immune system, you'd be using more of like 3 to 5 milliliters, which is like up to about a teaspoon. But that's just kind of a general rule of thumb. There are a lot of variables.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Maria. I think that's about all the time for questions that we have. And we're so grateful to have you with us. And I just have one slide to share before we move on to the next workshop. And I just want to thank you all as well for attending. And let's see, real quick, I'm going to put this up. Okay. All right, so just thanks again, Maria, for your expertise and sharing with us, and everybody for all your great questions. NOFA is excited to be celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And so if you're not already, we'd love for you to join our growing community by becoming a member in 2021. Scholarship members are available. Please also check out our virtual exhibitor fair, including our book list hosted by Main Street Bookends, where you can get copies of the books by our authors, speakers, and others. As Maria said earlier, 20% of proceeds will go back to NOFA to support us throughout the year. All right, we're looking forward to the next workshop, and that's going to be Growing Organic Fruit and Nut Trees, 20 Years of Tree Crop Trials with Keith Morris of Willow Crossing Farm in Vermont, and that is going to start at 10:15. And Nikki, if you could put a link to that in the chat, that'd be great. Also, if anyone hasn't seen it and would like, maybe Nikki could put a link to the program guide in the chat for everyone. And hopefully we'll see you all at the next workshop at 10:15. All right. Thanks, everybody, very much. Thanks, Maria. Have a great weekend.